Welcome to Shaken Not Burned, a cocktail of solutions for a sustainable future. I'm Felicia Jackson.
And I am Giulia Bottaro. Each week we interview experts to talk about parts of the sustainable transition and what you and your business need to know to succeed.
Sustainability is complex and constantly evolving, and it can be hard for a business to adapt and remain competitive.
We are here to help you learn all about the changing economy and the ongoing transition.
So join us as we explore the concepts and the tools you need to plot a course for a sustainable future. Welcome back to Shaken Not Burned, where today we're going to explore the intersection of business, nature and sustainability. I'm your host, Felicia Jackson, and today we're lucky enough to be joined by Alastair Cooper, Head of Venture at Cibus Capital, and he's going to help us understand what's happening in one of the most critical areas for both mitigation and adaptation, the need for a sustainable food system. From the food on our tables to the materials fueling global supply chains, agriculture is the backbone of the economy. And research shows that not only that agriculture is responsible for around a quarter of global emissions, but that over 55% of the world's companies are critically dependent on nature. In an era of climate change, supply chain disruptions, and shifting consumer demands, the business of agriculture is facing an unprecedented change. Nature's no longer just a backdrop to business, it's fundamental in the operations of the economy. And that means incredible potential for resource efficiency, for carbon emissions, for biodiversity, food security, human health, and even animal welfare. The sector can contribute to both addressing climate risk and building adaptation into the global economic system. But in order to get there, we need to understand the risks and opportunities and where we can be most effective in achieving change. Alastair, welcome to the show. Perhaps we could kick off with an explanation of Cibus Capital and what you guys actually do.
Great. Well, thank you. We're delighted to be here. Cibus, or Cibus, the Latin word for food. We are a dedicated team based in London. We've got a couple of people in Australia. We've got one in North America. And we're focused on raising capital to fund what we call the food transition. And by that, we mean the transition of what is a broken food chain today in terms of supply-demand imbalance, perfect storm around resource limitation, but also in terms of the externalities that are being derived from our food system. And for us, this is about raising capital to finance using primarily technology to start changing that and to make a difference. And for us, that food transition is every big in terms of scale of financial need and scope as the energy transition that's been going on for the last 25 years or so. But the food transition is just starting. So we feel this is very much the first rung of the ladder we're at this point in time. And the technology revolution is a catalyst to provide the opportunity. That's our focus.
That sounds amazing, because obviously I've been following the energy transition for a long time. And it does seem to be the focal point. But when we talk about transition, it has to be so much more than energy. And if we don't transform these other systems, we're not going to achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. So what do you think the biggest challenges facing agriculture today is? And what are the risks and opportunities that you see?
I think that the challenges, the sort of mega challenges are two things. One is supply-demand imbalance. And clearly, we have a global food system based on utilizing finite resources. And by that, I mean everything from clean water, fertile soils, through to a range of fertilizers that are the main drivers for modern crop production and thereby animal production as well. But secondly, the problem is the externalities our current food production system has caused globally. And by that, I mean the cost to nature, biodiversity, but also the cost to climate change, as you just highlighted. You're just reducing by, for example, intensively cropping land, tilling that land repeatedly, typically in monocultures over decades, causes soil organic matter to deplete substantially. And that organic matter ends up becoming CO2 within the air. And I think the global food system to date does not price in the negative externalities that it causes. So as a food consumer, when we buy our food product, the cost of that food product is derived by the direct costs to produce that product and has no relation today to the externalities that the production of that product has caused.
So what you're saying is the way that we eat and drink as consumers doesn't involve paying for the costs of everything that it takes to get that food or drink from wherever it comes to our plates.
And that's at an environmental level. Could be the environmental runoff into the watercourse from phosphate or nitrogen fertilizers and the secondary effects that causes in terms of algal blooms, and depletion of ecosystem right out from rivers out to sea. But it also could be things like medical health, the increasing incidence of diabetes and the cost to the National Health Service, heart disease, etc., as secondary outcomes from a food production system and diet, which perhaps is not, shall we say, ideal.
Now, when you're talking about the increase in diabetes and the health issues, for me, that sort of links to this idea of ultra-processed foods and the fact that we're not having vitamins and minerals in our foods. Is that the sort of thing that you're talking about? The idea that to get as much food as possible, this calorie-dense food into people to be comfortable is just what our current economic system encourages?
Yes, I think obviously there's enormous complexities to it, but we've obviously developed a food production system. The big food companies, the big food processors have gone down a route, some would say, that suits them in terms of producing foodstuffs which are high in margin and low risk for them. And that obviously has, as a byproduct, had a vast growth over the last couple of decades in the percentage of ultra-high processed foods that are used, the incorporation of high fructose corn syrup, and the production of foods that we would now think as unhealthy, but sadly, large populations depend on them. And part of that also is the nutrient density that you spoke about. I think most studies that I've seen, when they look at plant crops in particular, clearly the nutrient density has depleted over time, mainly because the nutrients and minerals within the soils in which they've been grown have depleted over time. So the plants cannot incorporate as much into their body mass. On top of that, the plants genetically have been evolved to respond very fast to artificial fertilizers. So they grow much quicker. I tend to have much higher water incorporation because of that, rather than nutrient incorporation that generally comes from a slower grown product. And everything that happens to plants has a knock-on effect, obviously, to animals that eat those plants typically. So it is a big issue in terms of health. And then the final point I think I would make is the incorporation of compounds and chemicals within foods and drinks, which clearly are not beneficial. And that could be synthetic chemical colorants, all these bright colors in our foods and drinks that we give to our children as a great example of that. So we were delighted earlier in January when the US actually started to ban some of those key bright red colors as an example. And everyone is obviously watching with enormous interest what RFK Jr. is going to start doing. Clearly, he's made some pretty aggressive comments around the food system poisoning the young of the US and wanting to make it much healthier. And he said he's going to be targeting specifically ultra-high processed foods and a lot of these compounds, chemicals, colorants, and additives that have been put in foods. So it'll be interesting to see what happens out of that.
I think there's a really interesting dichotomy that's developing at the moment, that you need regulation in order to control some of the ways in which companies do business if you want to get to a certain end point, say, for example, food system without UPF. But at the same time, it can be very challenging to implement those regulations to get political support for them, especially if they do things like put up the price of food. So one of the areas that's really interesting is, and this is bringing it back to the externalities you mentioned earlier, is to look at different ways we can understand fully the costs and the implications of what we do within the food system. Could you explain to me how useful concepts like ecosystem services, natural capital, how do they interrelate and what role do they play in how we understand the cost and the value of elements of the food system?
This is an area, obviously, that I think we're all growing in terms of understanding the magnitude of the importance of natural capital and ecosystem services. And when I talk about natural capital, it basically is all the benefits in nature that man derives a benefit from. That would be the broadest term. So it could be plants and wild plants that are producing oxygen to provide the oxygen in our air. It could be soils that are filtering water and cleaning it and providing clean water for us. It could be the bees and pollinators that are pollinating our crops. So there's an incredibly wide spectrum of what we call ecosystem services that man benefits from. And obviously, this modern food system that's been built up post the Second War, I would say, has been built up with a relative disregard to nature's ecosystem benefits and has much more myopically been focused on producing key foods. And the growth and production of those foods has been quite remarkable. Mankind's ability to innovate has been staggering, but it has come at a cost. And I think we're now looking to start really focusing on that cost, understanding the cost, measure that cost, and then reverse perhaps detrimental elements. And of all the areas of ecosystem services, undoubtedly, the biggest area is around carbon and carbon sequestration. Mm-hmm. And clearly, all of us are very focused on this issue of carbon dioxide buildup in the air and climate change. And a very large amount of that, from the point I made earlier, comes from organic matter that has been metabolized from the soil and has moved back into the air. And now we have the ability to start reversing that at scale. I always think that the best example is the whole Midwest of the States, which for tens and probably millions of years was prairie land, was grazed by 50 million bison. And those mob grazing bison allowed grasslands of enormous complexity and diversity to grow. And the soil down to 30 centimeters below those grasslands would have been at least 10% organic matter. Those same grasslands today are now intensively farmed land, really the breadbasket of the US. And the organic matter in those soils is now between 1% and 2% organic matter. So 8% plus organic matter has been metabolized from the soil into the air during modern farming. That equates to like 375 tons of CO2 per hectare. Vast amounts. So my point is, land, both below ground, but also above ground in biomass, can provide a fabulous service to mankind by sequestering carbon from the atmosphere into a stable form.
This is one of the areas why agriculture is so fascinating, because the key focus has been in the last couple of decades on CO2 mitigation, on greenhouse gas mitigation. But actually with soil, you can tuck it away. Healthy soil tucks it away and supports all these different systems. So it's really interesting to hear you talk about it and explain it. Can you talk me through what frameworks exist that actually help you assess natural capital or the value of natural capital?
There are quite a few frameworks out there, and I would probably say many of them are only used by a small amount of people. So it's still evolving in terms of where people are going to coagulate around a certain framework or two.
There's no standard yet.
Well, there's quite a wide range. We certainly use ourselves the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and we use that as a framework and use what they call their LEAP protocols around that for disclosing and measuring. But wider than that, the common frameworks would be the Natural Capital Protocol. Mm-hmm. There are various accounting models, the SEEA, and the Eco-Service Valuation Model, TEEB. It goes on and on.
Would it be fair to say that we're where we were with energy and the greenhouse gas protocol and understanding carbon emissions, we're where we were 25 years ago in terms of nature and understanding its implications, and of people seriously integrating that into how they make financial decisions?
Well, I think that's right. And to be able to integrate nature into how you make financial decisions, you need some building blocks. Yeah. Let's be clear. So you need reliable data and information, which you can firstly establish the baseline and then monitor and accredit it on an ongoing basis before you can start measuring it, monetizing it, or using it as a way of penalizing. Mm-hmm. So you need clarity and you need quality of data. So in the venture space around this, as an example, probably the fastest growing area of agri-food venture investing over the last 2 or 3 years has been around what I would call natural capital enabling technologies. Okay. So these are technologies that allow us to measure in a way that makes sense, at a scale that makes sense, at a price that makes sense. And you need that integrity of information before anybody can start accounting for it. And then extrapolating that data. So that's the process we're really going through at the moment. And there's a company we've just invested in called Earth Optics, which is a US company, which we're very excited about, growing incredibly fast. And it's doing just that. And it's a combination of below ground soil primarily, about digitizing our soils, understanding all the physical components within soil, but also the biological components within soil, and scaling that. Using physical soil testing, but also using satellites and other means of doing it and extrapolating to a larger scale as well. And it's that type of technology which I think is going to be vital.
So that's really about using real-time data to understand the changes that are happening so you can actually keep track of what's going on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, because one has to achieve this baseline to understand where you are to, in effect, provide a sort of accounting mechanism for what you're going to measure, for also understanding where that farm lies versus other farms in terms of its relative quality or not. And when you look where pressures are coming and where this market's evolving, to a large degree, strategies like the mitigation of scope 3 emissions are going to drive change. So we very much see a big corporation, big companies looking at their scope 3 emissions. And then as they are given more data back through their supply chains, right back to the farmer, they can start making material decisions about how they can start improving their scope 3 and benefiting. Hopefully that will then start driving capital from that end CPG company or food company back to the farm, where actually 70 to 75% of the emissions are probably occurring. So that's what we see happen.
There is this idea that data is the requirement in order to be able to make strategic changes. And there's been a lot of discussion in the last few months, obviously, with a lot of pushback on ESG about how reporting is really complicated and it's very expensive. But actually, it's that data that is necessary in order to be able to make the right kinds of choices that mean that you're going to have a business in 5 years' time. Yeah. I mean, is that how you see things, or do you see it differently?
No, very much so. It's about scaling this data. It's about having reliable data. And then it's about, in some way, monetizing that data for the outcome you want.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, driving change is about money.
Yeah. That's why I asked about natural capital frameworks, because in the end, you can have all the regulation in the world, but if the money's all going in one direction, you need to realign capital to achieve change.
And you've also got, and you kind of mentioned it earlier or alluded to it earlier, there is a difference between short-term and long-term, and making long-term decisions that are going to be of real benefit to mankind versus short-term worrying about, for example, food inflation in the short term, which might steer the wrong decisions. And that's a real problem. Politics does come into this, and the fragility of politics. And I think things are moving really fast, and the pressures are moving fast. Legislation is moving fast, and it will be a combination of penalizing bad stuff but rewarding good stuff. And that's what's going to drive the change ultimately.
Now, so you're in a position in the market where you do see what's happening at the cutting edge. As a venture investor, you mentioned you look at sort of technological solutions, and you mentioned one of the investments you've made. But where do you invest? Where do you see the biggest growth in this market being? And what's driving it? Is it appetite from companies reporting? Is it being driven by concern about fines and being put on the spot? Or is it about companies which are looking to find a competitive advantage, which are recognizing the challenges that come with agriculture?
To answer your most recent question first, we're big believers that companies that incorporate the highest quality, resource efficiency, sustainability, and adherence to these type of areas of like maximizing natural capital are going to be the companies that outcompete and more resilient over the long term. We're big believers that ultimately profitability and thereby the value of the company will be judged by financial performance that'll be driven partly by being, should we say, a good operator within this new universe. In terms of where we see opportunity set, we invest very broadly from large operating production assets through to enabling technologies.
In the context of food and agriculture, what is a large-scale operating facility? Just for our audience members who aren't.
So large scale, as an example, we built up and have just recently sold the second largest olive oil company in the world. Is 20,000 acres, which is 8,000 hectares of super intensive olive production.
Okay.
Producing around, at its height, about 12 million litres of extra virgin olive oil per year. And that would be a key production asset, which we very much, just to be clear, we integrated. Well, one, we grew the asset substantially, but we integrated cutting edge technologies, for example, around irrigation systems, fertigation systems, sensors around those, predictive analytics around the delivery, incorporating climate data, so that we were minimizing water use and minimizing synthetic chemical and fertilizer use to way below the industry standards. And we also built out the largest organic olive oil business in the world within that as well. We were very much believers that moving in the direction of sustainability and resource efficiency would be a benefit to the bottom line, but also for the secondary benefits that we spoke about earlier. But that would be a great example.
So you mentioned that you invest in these big operating facilities and then also in emerging enabling technologies. Can you talk me through where you see some of those opportunities?
As an example, Earth Optics, which I mentioned earlier, which is producing the necessary data around soil and both in farmland, rangeland, pastureland at enormous scale, millions of acres. So not only is it establishing that baseline, but it then will monitor it and provide that data to a company that then needs to accredit it. So the opportunities as a venture investor around the technologies that provide the data and measure the data, but also accreditation companies that actually, Vera would be an example that many people might have heard of, through to a fintech opportunity, because often credits and benefits need to be monetized in some way as well. On top of that, there are many other ancillary natural capital technologies. And we're invested, for example, in a company called Bee Hero. And Bee Hero is the by far the most advanced globally company providing sensor technology in beehives to optimize bee health and thereby provide pollination services at enormous scale. That area of pollination services, remember, 70% of all our crops are dependent on insect pollination in order for them to be viable. So improving pollination, the efficiency of pollination is critical. But also many of those crops will increase yields with increased pollination. So again, optimizing that is pretty critical. So I give those two examples.
I mean, that sounds amazing because, I mean, I've read so much about the challenges we've got around pollinators and heard stories about farmers taking hives from one place to another in order to help with the pollination. So it's actually very exciting to see that there is technology being used to enable, as you say, the scaling up of a natural process. So what do you see the role of private capital as in this transformation of the agriculture sector?
It's going to be absolutely vital. The ag transformation, as I said, is so far behind, for example, the energy transformation. Food and agriculture, I think, is woefully underinvested in terms of technology, digitization, penetration compared to other industries. And we need capital to come into this space to allow young, exciting startups, small companies to grow, to deliver technologies that can affect the change to which we refer. And it's a tough space. If you look at data in terms of capital flows into what we call agri-food tech, before 2015, it was negligible. It just wasn't an area that was investable, that there were no companies in the space. In the later sort of teens, capital flows started to accelerate, predominantly from the US and predominantly from the West Coast. You know, at the end of the day, a venture industry like this is all about capital availability and where that capital is available. It then peaked at the end of 21, as you would expect. And since then, there's been a brutal correction in the space. Valuations have been hit very hard. And what was seen as the sort of big winners across agri-food tech have been pretty aggressively corrected, should we say, in terms of their position and valuations.
And are you talking about the alternative proteins market here? Because that's the one that really collapsed.
Yeah, it's to be honest, sadly, it's wider than that. I would say alternative dairy and meat was probably the hardest hit of all, as you say. But right across the board of agri-food tech, it's been tough. I'd say food tech has suffered more than agri-tech. But we definitely are at a point in time where the amount of investors in the space are much fewer than they were 3 or 4 years ago. Generalists have kind of pulled out of the space. And we need confidence to build again. And we need capital to start inflowing again. You know, M&A activity has kind of slowed to nothing, obviously, at the moment within ag and food. The public markets are closed in terms of IPOs. So this is a sort of tough period we're going through. It's a correction period. It's a consolidation period. It's a kind of roll-up period. But the sector needs to gain in credibility. And by that, we need some winners. We need capital flow, we need winners, and we need exits. And that's what we're all striving towards. And I've got to say, I find it very rewarding because it's a very collaborative place. And we invest alongside other pretty dedicated investors, trying to get this work done. I'm a big believer the tailwinds behind this whole transition are only accelerating.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a big believer in the next 2 or 3 years, this will be a fabulous place to invest for the long term. So that's the way we're approaching it.
Well, that brings up two questions for me. And instead of asking them both at once, I will ask them one by one this time. The first one is, what is it that you look for when you're looking at a startup or a scaling company in this space?
We've become very focused. 7 or 8 years ago, we were taking quite early technology risk. For example, in the alternative protein space that you mentioned. And cellular meat would be a great example.
Yep.
Vertical farming would be a great example. And the truth is that it's really tough to find the winner in an area that's a new area that's trying to build where the technology is not yet proven. That's a tough process. And it's very difficult to predict timelines. And obviously, we went straight into COVID, a macroeconomic downturn, a Ukrainian invasion. There was, to be honest, a perfect storm hitting venture companies. Now we're much more focused on investing in venture companies who are a little more progressed. So we like particularly the area of agri-tech, where we see a technology we believe is proven and where it shows a very clear return on investment for the end user, ideally for the farmer. And by looking at and analyzing and studying that return on investment and value added to the farmer, talking to the customers and clients that they're selling to, that gives us the confidence to invest at that point. So I would say we're very focused on that kind of slightly lower risk, later stage venture investment as a point of entry.
Okay, and then that does make a lot of sense. The second question that sort of came out of that is government regulation. We know that the UK government is aware of the need to act on nature. We've seen that with biodiversity net gain. What do you think we need to see in agriculture in the UK, perhaps even in Europe, to help drive this market? Because as you say, capital flow comes with confidence. Confidence comes with success and a clear view of what you're looking at in 2, 3, 4 years' time.
Well, the British government has obviously made some pretty brave decisions. And post-Brexit, we've very fast, at very high speed, moved from land-based subsidies for farmers. And I've got to declare my interest here. I am an organic farmer myself. So we've moved from this land-based subsidy system to one where, as a farmer, you get paid for services that you give to the public.
Mm-hmm.
And that's moved remarkably fast. And many farmers haven't responded fast enough to it. But at the moment, there is a wide range of opportunities there for natural capital and ecosystem services that are incentivized by government grants. And as a farmer, you have to do that to be able to receive any government grants now. You can't rely on your land base. So my point is things have changed very fast indeed, whether it's 6-meter margins with tusky grasses, which are fabulous ecosystems for beneficial insects, for example, hoverflies and parasitic wasps, ladybirds, that will then go and eat the aphids that are in my crop instead of having to use an insecticide.
So using nature to fight nature.
Yes.
Okay.
As an example. But also, hedge planting, tree planting, nectar and pollen areas, wild bird seed areas, buffers around water courses, et cetera, managing and restoring woodland. Those are the areas that are getting paid now by the government.
And they all seem to be areas which focus on resilience, on building the ability of the natural system to hold water and hold, as you say, organic matter in the soils. I suppose my next question is really, when we're talking about capital flows, where is the gap in nature finance? Because if we've got governments supporting resilience, we've got venture investments supporting fairly well-established technologies, where's the gap and what sort of money do we need to come into the market?
Well, there's nothing like enough money in the venture space.
Well, there never
nothing
is.
Like there's a pitiful amount of money. If you look at the capital availability and what's being invested today versus other sectors. And part of that comes back to this credibility issue I mentioned earlier. But part of it comes back to structure and encouragement around those investors. We need significantly higher capital directed at new technologies and venture companies that are going to enable the change that we spoke about earlier. On top of that, I think coming from the other end of the equation, which is back to the bigger corporations, I think the direction of travel is pretty well set, both within the EU and the UK, in terms of tighter rules on disclosure and tighter rules around liabilities within the numbers that are disclosed. And that's what's going to drive change, because if you're a Unilever and you're under enormous pressure to mitigate your scope 3, if you actually can assimilate and have delivered the appropriate data, you can then have much more clarity around how you can make the right decisions right back to the farm, and also how you're prepared to inset those decisions within your own liabilities. So I think that's certainly starting to happen. But it's much more than food companies and retailers, as an example. It's banks, it's insurance companies. Everybody's under pressure. And I'm hoping that capital will flow back to the farmer as well to encourage the right decisions to be made.
Now, there's a really interesting discussion going on at the European level at the moment with the EU Omnibus, and the idea that they're actually going to delay the implementation of some of the harsher reporting requirements, the issue around liabilities in the CSDDD. Do you think that is going to slow down adoption in the market, or do you think it was a necessary step to enable people to find the time to put in place the data collection practices that they need?
Again, it comes back to this sort of political issue, doesn't it? In terms of if you are going to be aggressive about, in effect, penalizing negative externalities, you're ultimately going to put up the cost of food. And at the moment, with inflation as it is over the last few years, with the fragility we've all seen post the Ukrainian invasion, etc., I think there is a natural aversion by politicians and leaders to do anything that's going to, shall we say, rock that boat or increase risk around that too much. So I think that's why they're going a little slower than perhaps some of us would have hoped. But ultimately, they've got to keep the pressure up, and that will drive change.
Yeah. No, I mean, I agree. It's just really nice to hear someone say it with such clarity, because I think it is really challenging, especially in the media. I know I'm in the media, but there's all these discussions about, what does it mean and what matters and what doesn't, and whether everyone's going to run away from it. Whereas it does seem to be part of a growing understanding that if we're going to have a functional and resilient and sustainable economy, we have to have functional and resilient systems that operate within it. I would be really interested to hear your thoughts on what you think investors and entrepreneurs should be paying attention to in the next 5 to 10 years. Because 2030 is one of those dates where we're supposed to have achieved a lot of goals or partway steps towards some of the longer term goals, but it's very, very close. What trends do you think are going to dominate the conversation?
Well, when you say trends are going to dominate, obviously I'm looking at food and ag predominantly. And clearly the natural capital trend and the monetization of it is going to be enormous. And probably the country most advanced in the world in that respect is Australia, and our team in Australia is very focused on that area as opportunities for investment. The Australians were way ahead of anybody else in terms of valuing carbon, pricing carbon, and also creating a model where producers of emissions have that penalized and under pressure to mitigate and offset their detrimental effects at scale. And that's sort of set in law within Australia. Australia also has a vast landmass, so the ability to mitigate using natural solutions at scale in a way that other parts of the world perhaps don't have. So I think Australia is a really interesting opportunity, and we're looking to do something there right at this moment as an example. But right away, right across food and ag, for us, this is about minimizing resource use, minimizing synthetic chemical use, using technology to do that, to do stuff smarter. In agriculture, of all the issues, the biggest one is the use of artificial nitrogen. And the world, since the Second World War, has built a food production system that is vastly reliant on artificial nitrogen from the Haber-Bosch process. And the Haber-Bosch process uses, an extraordinary amount of energy, both in terms of heat and pressure, to produce this artificial nitrogen in the form of urea. But it is then applied to crops, and only around 33% of the artificial nitrogen is ever incorporated into the biomass of the crop itself. The balance ends up in the atmosphere, either in the soil and washed through the watercourse, or into the air as nitrous oxide. And as you well know, nitrous oxide is 330 times as bad a greenhouse gas as CO2. So it's incredibly bad and destructive for us. So anything that can reduce that reliance on artificial nitrogen, as an example, is of enormous focus. And a lot of interest at the moment is around using microbes to help with that process, symbiotic microbes within the soil, around the roots themselves, within the rhizosphere, or even endophytic microbes that live within the plant itself, fixing nitrogen within the plant. But all areas of nutrients, phosphates would be a big focus as well. And it's not just microbes, it's obviously genetic progression around the plants themselves. We're now obviously starting to look at gene editing in a way that we haven't in the past. And the UK has a pretty unique ability to be more flexible on that front, and about restructuring pathways within the plants to be more efficient, for example, at photosynthesis, which then has a knock-on effect that you need less artificial nitrogen. But there's also ways about delivering synthetic chemicals. We're invested in a company called robotics, which has a robotic sprayer with cameras. And the cameras can identify a little 1 centimeter weed from a 1 centimeter crop leaf. It then has controlled nozzles every 4 centimeters across the spray boom. And it will be told just to spray that one little weed leaf and nothing else. So instead of that blanket spraying that we've all our lives of pretty indiscriminate spraying that gets blown in the wind and drifts, instead of that, you're having 3 centimeter by 3 centimeter area little directed sprays just hitting the weed itself and nothing else. Mm-hmm. That reduces, for example, synthetic chemical use, herbicide use by 95%. So there's a whole range of technologies like this coming through, which I think are vital and providing significant opportunities. I just come back from Paris yesterday, and we've got a company there called M2I that produces pheromones. And this is working on the basis that most insects that are pests in agriculture are reliant on the female insect producing a pheromone to attract her mate. Obviously, they get together, and it's their progeny that are the pests in farming. And of all the strategies that we can see to significantly reduce the use of synthetic chemical insecticides, using pheromones seems to be the best way. And this is working on the basis that each insect produces its own pheromone that's specific to that species. So you have to actually manufacture that exact same compound for each species of insect. Sure. And then it's about having that pheromone in place at the point in time those insects are mating out on the farm, confusing the insect, they don't mate, and so they don't produce their progeny. And the technology around that as an example.
I remember there was a huge project to cut malaria that I think involved sterile malaria-carrying mosquitoes that was incredibly effective. And I have to say that listening to you talk about this, there is so much that is constantly said about, we need to act on climate, we need to act on nature, this idea that we have a moral duty, that there is a public good that should be fulfilled. But as you mentioned earlier, one of the greatest challenges is that if you can't persuade money and politicians to change their approach, we'll never get the changes we see. And what you're explaining is how companies and economies, they can save resources, they can minimize waste, they can find new ways of doing, they can scale up responses and actually do it in a way that's healthy and sustainable for everyone.
Yeah. And the other part of it we haven't mentioned is the consumer. Obviously, the consumer has to have the right information to make the right choices, and I don't feel that's necessarily the case at the moment. So this could be everything through to material labeling on foods and drinks that actually show the consumer if some indication, for example, of natural capital or carbon or other issues, depending on what one decides is most important to show, or the healthiness of that product, et cetera, et cetera. That direction needs to increase as well.
Then I agree with you about the labeling. I think that's really important. But I think there's a wider need for understanding about the interrelation between these things and the consequences for the individual. It's a bit like not investing in renewable energy in the early days because it was too expensive. But then when the Russian invasion happened, suddenly we're paying really expensive gas prices. So again, it comes back to your point about short-term versus long-term. And we need to be able to start thinking about things in a different way if we're going to be able to make those kind of informed decisions.
All new technologies seem to be like that, to be honest, because obviously when the new company with the new technology starts off, everything's very expensive. Mm. And you obviously, as an investor, have to extrapolate forward and hope that the direction of travel and direction of progress is going to be one where it meets parity with the traditional incumbent. Grid parity, which is what you referred to a second ago. And we use that, cellular meat. We talk about griddle parity as an example. So that analogy is widely used.
What I wanted to say was thank you so much for joining us today. It's been absolutely wonderful listening to you talk about this market and how it's changing. One of my favorite questions is always, what haven't I asked you about that I should have done? Or do you think we've covered enough
Well,
today?
I've got to say, we actually have managed, I've probably rambled away across quite a wide area. We've even covered the nitty-gritty of political decisions, short-term versus long-term, which is always a tough one. And
it's a tough one, but it is fundamental to everything in the world of sustainability.
Selfishly, my biggest focus is about gaining a confidence and investment flows into the venture space to develop these enabling technologies, which I think are going to really enable a change. And that's my main focus.
Well, I think that's a great point to finish our conversation in, because what we're talking about is enabling change. And what we want is for people to understand what goes into that and how we make that happen, whether it's political will, consumer choices, capital flow, or just investing in the right company at the right time and scaling it up to really make a difference.
Absolutely.
Wonderful. Listen, Alastair, thank you so much for joining us today. To our listeners, I hope you've enjoyed our conversation and I hope you've learned something interesting. We'll be back soon.
Thank you.